In this lecture, I'd like to talk a little bit about risk and uncertainty and what ideas economists have in mind when these two terms are being used. As a backdrop to this, I'd like to go back to the housing crisis of 2006, 7, 8, and 9 and talk for a minute about the formula that was used to calculate risk. Part of the housing crisis can be attributed to an error that was made in translating uncertainty into risk through a mathematical formula. The formula was created by a mathematician named David Lee, although certainly the creation of the formula is not the same thing as its misuse. But the formula was designed to measure the correlation, how the co-movement between various assets that made up what were known as collateralized debt obligations, or CDOs. Now, there was some uncertainty about how one asset's failure would affect the prices of other assets. And part of that uncertainty was just because, or was the result of, never having gone through an economic crisis when these types of assets or instruments like CDOs existed. So the solution that was used by many financial economists was to use past credit default swaps, or CDSs, which are basically insurance products that pay off when a company goes bankrupt or defaults on its debt. Use those as an estimate of the correlation of returns, which is pretty clever, but it was imperfect. And the reason it was imperfect is because all of that data came, even on credit default swaps, came from a time when housing prices were on the rise. And what was the case in this instance was that the correlations actually changed pretty dramatically from a period of increasing prices to a period of decreasing prices. Now, everyone was using that formula, and we've seen in hindsight how that all turned out. But it highlights an important distinction that all of us need to make when thinking like economists between risk and uncertainty. Risk is how we characterize our uncertainty about the values that are variable. And typically we model this using random variables and distributions. And in doing that, in modeling random outcomes as a certain distribution, we're able to quantify certain aspects or dimensions of that, the mean, the variance or standard deviation, and so on. Uncertainty is a term that economists refer to refer to the idea of not knowing really what we don't know about. So not even knowing what the right distribution should be, or perhaps not even knowing about what some of the potential outcomes are. It's very easy, in other words, if we quantify unknown future events as, say, a normal distribution, it's very easy to fall into a false sense of security that we kind of have a good handle on all of the possible future outcomes. Uncertainty, from an economic perspective, can be thought of as a term referring to this idea that we don't know what we don't know, and as a result there may be future scenarios or future economic outcomes that are simply outside the realm of any statistical model or distribution that we use, and therefore these things are inherently hard to predict or anticipate. And this difference is really critical in financial markets because risk can be predicted and priced and traded and understood, and people are pretty comfortable with risk. But dealing with uncertainty is much more difficult, and making mistakes in the realm of uncertainty can be very much more costly. Consider the investors in IndyMac. Look at these annual net income numbers from IndyMac. This mortgage lender was actually taking on, in the late 90s and early 2000s, a lot of risk, or there was a lot of uncertainty, but investors were just ignoring it. Now, if you had asked an economist to forecast IndyMac's annual net income, they would have fit a trend line to the black data and estimated some kind of confidence interval around that black data, and it would have been some upward sloping projection with a range plus or minus in either direction. The interval would have been relatively small because the variability over this historical period, illustrated by the black positive increasing profits, was pretty smooth. And it would have completely missed the economic crisis of 2007 and 2008, an event that Nicholas Nassim Taleb, the author of Black Swans, refers to as a black swan, an event that is unpredictable, unanticipated, very rare, but does and can exist. As he said, I have nothing against economists. You should let them entertain themselves with their theories and elegant mathematics, but do not give any of them risk management responsibilities. Einstein once said that elegance is for tailors, and so as we study economics and as we think about economic ideas, it is important that we never get too far caught up or get too overly comfortable with or develop a false sense of security about our understanding and control of the risk in the world in which we live. Part of that is recognizing your circle of competence, knowing what you know, and knowing what you don't know. This is one of the reasons the great investor Warren Buffett, for instance, has been so successful. He invests only in companies and industries that fit within what he calls his circle of competence. And anything outside of that, he's very, very forthright and willing to admit that he doesn't understand and doesn't invest in. Now, uncertainty is unavoidable, so what do? Well, we can cope with uncertainty in decision making, one, by gathering more information. So how do we gather better information? Well, firms do this in many different ways. Best Buy uses a very dispersed set of non-experts to predict future variables and uses those very dispersed predictions to model possible future outcomes, including holiday sales rates. Google has internal prediction markets that forecast demand and or generate demand forecasts for Google. A U.S. Marine advice is that we can never eliminate uncertainty, and so we have to learn, in the case of the Marines, to fight effectively despite it. They do this by, one, developing simple, flexible plans, two, planning for likely contingencies, three, developing standing operating procedures, and four, fostering initiative among subordinates. Thanks for listening.